Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Institute of South Asian Studies, ISAS, and Conrad Adenauer Shiftong CAS panel discussion titled Sri Lanka under Gotabaya Rajapaksa, Domestic Challenges and International Priorities. Before we proceed with the event, I would appreciate if you could mute your video and microphone throughout the session. We will also appreciate if you could forward your questions via this chat to the moderator. The questions will be consolidated for the panelists to answer. This afternoon, we are delighted to have with us Her Excellency Shashikala Premawardene, High Commissioner of Sri Lanka to Singapore, Mr. Christian Achler, Director, Regional Program, Political Dialogue Asia, CAS Singapore, and Professor C. Rajamohan, Director, ISAS NUS. We are also delighted to have the following panelists: Dr. Chulani Atanayaka, Visiting Research Fellow, ISAS NUS, Dr. Latoya Waha, Deputy Director, Political Dialogue Asia, CAS Singapore, Dr. Amitandu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trinidad Economics, ISAS NUS, and Mr. Asanga Abhigunas Sirika, Founding Director General, Institute of National Security Studies, Sri Lanka. Professor Mohan will moderate the panel discussion. I now invite Her Excellency Premawardene to give the opening remarks. Her Excellency, please.
Thank you very much. Let me at the outset thank the Institute of South Asian Studies of the National University of Singapore and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for organizing this seminar on the 2020 parliamentary elections and the road ahead for Sri Lanka. I take this opportunity to welcome the very eminent panel of speakers that have agreed to speak on what I believe is a very timely and interesting topic. I want to thank those who are joining us from across the globe. Watching us through virtual space. I've been asked to make some welcome remarks. I intend to use the time allotted to me to give a broad outline of the road ahead for Sri Lanka following the recent elections. I believe the results of the recently concluded parliamentary election presents Sri Lanka with a historic opportunity. Sri Lanka has a robust democratic process, and time and again the people exercising their franchise have voted in governments to represent them. Basically, power has vacillated between the Sri Lanka Freedom Party and the United National Party. There have been coalitions, but many of them have been built around these two main political parties of the country. The recently concluded elections, however, saw the emergence of two newly formed political parties vying for supremacy, and therefore could be considered a significant break from the past. Certainly, they revolve around prominent personalities that belong to the two main political parties, but nevertheless, there are significant changes in the platforms that the two new parties represent. The parliamentary elections that were successfully concluded on the 5th of August saw the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, the party that's represented by His Excellency Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the President of Sri Lanka, emerging victorious, obtaining 59.09% of the total valid votes cast and securing 145 parliamentary seats out of the 225. Together with candidates that contested with this LPP alliance, they have a two-third majority in parliament. This was said to be impossible to achieve with the existing electoral system of proportional representation. Given that I understand Dr. Chulani will delve deeper into the composition of the new parliament and what that outcome represents, I don't intend to do so in these remarks. There was actually a better than expected voter turnout of 71% voter turnout recorded at this election. This is significant because the election was held amid global COVID-19 pandemic with extensive health guidelines having to be stringently followed. The election was praised as being free and fair by all political parties, including the main opposition and the international community. It was the first election to be held successfully amid the pandemic in South Asia. So the results of the parliamentary election must be analyzed considering the period that is the run-up to the election since November 2019. In November 2019, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa was elected as the seventh executive president of the country with over 6.9 million votes, which is about 52% of the total valid votes cast. So one of the main expectations of the people who voted for the president is an introduction of a new political culture in the country. The president was supported in his campaign by professionals representing diverse fields. His presidential campaign has been recognized as the world's first carbon neutral election campaign by Sustainable Futures Group. As the presidential candidate, he decided to hold more than 150 public rallies without using polythene, posters, banners, or cutouts, and nullify the carbon emitted for the rallies by planting a requisite number of trees. So these were actually very progressive steps that were seen during the elections. Even though hailing from a leading political family, President Rajapaksa had not been involved in active politics prior to being nominated as the presidential candidate. So his track record as the Secretary to the Ministry of Defense and also as the Secretary to the Ministry of Urban Development had been exemplary and positioned him in the minds of the general public as a result-oriented leader and a technocrat. In particular, he is credited with ending the 30-year-long conflict with the LTTE and in changing the landscape of Colombo, modernizing urban spaces, addressing long-standing issues of waste management and flooding, and creating a more livable city. By 2014, the Colombo landscape saw a phenomenal positive change. And these factors propelled the president as to the forefront as a leader who could make things happen. The period from November 2019 until the recent parliamentary elections proved to be extremely difficult and challenging. Sri Lanka was just beginning to see the signs of recovery after the Easter Sunday attacks of April 2019, when the COVID-19 pandemic struck the world, and there was an unprecedented global economic decline and travel. So Sri Lanka, which is highly dependent on tourism, earnings, foreign worker remittances, not through our export of garments and other merchandise. So we were also very badly affected by the COVID-19. But despite these difficulties, the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic was swift and effective. By the beginning of July, the government was able to gradually lift those restrictions. By August, Sri Lanka was able to hold the parliamentary elections, becoming one of the few countries in the world, like Singapore, to do so. So decisions such as involving the defense forces as a major stakeholder in the COVID-19 task force proved to be correct, because as no other government institution really had the manpower or the rapid reaction capability in fighting against the spread of the pandemic. The trust the president placed on the national healthcare system to come up with domestic solutions was hailed as a positive approach, which aided the confidence of healthcare officials. All in all, if we consider the COVID-19 pandemic as a litmus test for the new government of President Rajapaksa, then I think the government passed this test in every aspect. The successful containment of this pandemic in Sri Lanka cemented the president's image as a result-oriented leader and a technocrat. So at the moment, the caseload is 2,918 confirmed cases, of which 2,765 have recovered, and the death rate is at a very low 11 persons. So there were also other achievements during the COVID-19 affected past few months, which really, I think, contributed to the parliamentary election result. Sri Lanka's exports surpassed $1 billion mark, the $1 billion mark in July 2020 after 6 months. There was only a similar achievement at the start of this year. So the government did a commendable job in helping the garment and other industries to really adapt. So many of the garment sector really started producing PPE and masks and started exporting and adapting. So there were also new products that were able to make inroads into the Middle Eastern market, such as poultry during the COVID pandemic. Sri Lankan Airlines also continued to run cargo operations to selected destinations, including Singapore. Apart from that, the government also took steps to provide tax concessions targeting local entrepreneurs. Interest rates were brought down to encourage businesses. Competitive imports were restricted in order to protect the local entrepreneurs. And also there were other fiscal measures that were taken by the central bank, suspending loan repayments, launching concessional refinancing programs, And also the president set up under him a separate fund to respond to the COVID-19. Essential services during the lockdown period were also, I think, performed really well, so that the public could stay at home and minimize the spread of the disease. So these, the early lockdown, the testing, the tracing, the containment, all contributed to the success of the measures taken by the government. So the overwhelming victory that the SLPP won at the parliamentary elections should be analyzed, therefore, in this backdrop of the performance of the government in the 9 months in the lead up to the elections. The president's approach towards campaigning also during the COVID-19 gave kind of a justification to his promise of introducing a new political culture. He didn't really address rallies, but met with people and listened to their needs. I think this is also something new. And great efforts were made to conduct a campaign that was environmentally friendly. There also appears to be a gradual change in the voting patterns in the north and the east. So the SLPP and its allies made gains in the northern and eastern provinces of the country, which came as a surprise to many. The Tamil National Alliance secured 10 seats in the northern electoral districts. However, its support base had declined, as in the previous parliament, they had 16 seats. Interestingly, the EPDP, led by Mr. Douglas Devananda, who is a supporter of the Podujana Peramuna, secured 2 seats. And the Sri Lanka Freedom Party won a seat in the Jaffna district. Both the PDP and SLFP, although they contested separately, belong to the Podujana Peramuna alliance. There was also an interesting case where Ratnapriya Bandhu, a retired military official who previously headed the rehabilitation program of the ex-combatants, contested the general parliamentary elections. Although he couldn't really secure a seat in parliament, he was able to secure a significant number of votes in the Wanli district, which was predominantly Tamil, with a predominantly Tamil and Muslim population. So the SLPP gained ground in the north and the east, indicating a sense of confidence in the current government, which was previously not prevalent even when comparing with the results of the presidential election. It's also an indication that the people in the north and the east of the country wanted to move forward with real economic and social development. Key cabinet portfolios have been also assigned to several parliamentarians hailing from the Tamil and Muslim communities. We have our Justice Minister, Muhammad Ali Sabri, and then we also have 2 other ministers, Minister Douglas Devananda in charge of the as the Minister of Fisheries, and Mr. Jeevan Thondaman as the State Minister of Estate Housing and Community Infrastructure Facilities. So as the people have voted in the executive and the legislative from the same political party with a clear majority, there is expectation that there will be a quick turnaround of major domestic issues in a shorter period of time. When considering the way forward for Sri Lanka, there are some key domestic issues which will have to be attended to. And they include, inter alia, the revival of the economy, the strengthening of national security, and constitutional amendments. Key international challenges will, of course, be the garnering of international support for countries' development, while also maintaining a balanced foreign policy. The national policy framework of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa contains 10 key policies: priority to national security, friendly, non-aligned foreign policy, an administration free from corruption, new constitution that fulfills the people's wishes, productive citizenry and a vibrant human resource, people-centric economic development, technology-based society, development of physical resources, sustainable environmental management, disciplined, law-abiding, and a value-based society. So the 10 policies indicate the government's domestic priorities and its path towards international engagement. Understandably, the most prominent domestic priority in the short term will probably be the revival of the economy due to the stresses that have been experienced due to COVID-19. From the statement that His Excellency the President made yesterday at the inaugural session of the 9th Parliament of Sri Lanka, it's clear that the emphasis will be developing a production economy by reviving domestic and rural agriculture and industries. The President has advocated out-of-the-box thinking in order to meet the economic challenges posed in the new normal context. The idea is to create a people-centric economy with a focus on fields such as agriculture, plantation, fisheries, traditional industries, and the promotion of self-employment and job opportunities. The basic aim is to strengthen local economy and to increase export income. While there will be a focus on reviving the tea, coconut, and rubber sectors, focus will also be on the promotion of export crops such as cinnamon and pepper. Measures are also afoot to earn a large, to try to earn foreign exchange, adding value to our exports of natural resources such as gems and minerals. There will also be a methodical development of our traditional industries such as batik, local apparel, brass, cane, pottery, furniture, gems and jewelry. And these are expected to really create self-employment opportunities and create new employment opportunities, as well as build businesses that can earn large amounts of foreign exchange for the country. 1/3 of the country's populations depend on agriculture, plantation, and fisheries as their livelihood. So the development of these industries will also be infused with new approaches based on technology and innovation, and that's a part of what the president really wants to achieve, and something that he has promised he would do. There are several new ministerial portfolios which have been exclusively introduced with a focus on manufacturing sector of the country. And these are, for example, one such new state ministerial portfolio is of pharmaceutical production and supply and regulation. I think this is something that also perhaps came in line because of the COVID-19 and the fact that we had to have self-sufficiency in medical supplies. As much as we need to also find self-sufficiency in food security. So these new ministries have been put in place to have a focused approach on revival of these industries, which will be critical for the future of the country. Certainly, I think the GDP rates will have and performance will have to be reviewed in terms of what was really projected or what really the president wanted to achieve because of the pandemic. He had projected at the time of his election a 6.5% or higher up to 2025, but obviously because of what has happened, they will have to be reviewed. But it's one of the key. I think the export performance during this time has shown that Sri Lanka is very resilient and is able to adapt. And that's a good sign for us moving forward. And perhaps also the most important future activity will also to be to try and get foreign direct investments into projects into the country. So in this regard, I think attracting investments into large infrastructure projects will be important. So in order to restore the confidence of the people in the security of the country, which had been severely affected by the Easter Sunday attacks that occurred in 2019, President Rajapaksa established firmly that the primary policy of his government is national security, ensuring national security. So he's restructured the security apparatus and intelligence services, eliminating fears of the people, and thereby restoring the security of the country and recreating an environment in which every citizen can live freely without fear for the safety of their lives, for their safety of themselves and their families. As undertaken, he launched efforts to protect people against social evils such as cracking down on the activities of the underworld and drug menace, which have been a hindrance to the day-to-day lives of the people. And this has also increased the confidence of the public in government mechanisms and the steps that the government has taken. With a 2/3 majority in Parliament, the government is expected to go about the task of introducing the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, for which Cabinet approval has been obtained recently. The President stated yesterday when addressing Parliament, and I quote, the basis of the success of a democratic state is its Constitution. Our Constitution, which has been amended 19 times from its inception in 1978, has many ambiguities and uncertainties, presently resulting in confusion. As the people have given us a mandate, we wanted for a constitutional amendment. Our first task will be to remove the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. After that, all of us will get together to formulate a new constitution suitable for the country. In this, the priority will be given to the concept of one country, one law for all people. An unstable parliament that cannot take firm decisions and succumbs to extremist influences very often is not suitable for a country. While introducing a new constitution, it is essential to make changes to the current electoral system while retaining the salutary aspects of the proportional representation system. These changes will be made to ensure stability of the parliament and people's direct representation, unquote. So the government is expected to engage widely in order to draft a new constitution, and also there will be measures taken to introduce the 20th Amendment to the Constitution. So it is expected that protecting the unitary nature of the state and protecting and nurturing the Buddha Sasana while also will form an integral part of this process, and securing the freedom of all citizens to practice their religious belief and of their choice is expected to be secured as well. There have been several steps that the president has wanted to introduce to ensure harmony among the many communities that make up Sri Lanka. So one of that is the establishment of an Inter-Religious Advisory Council under the chairmanship of the president to deal with any kind of minor tensions that might arise between the communities. The government has identified the use of lands as one of the main factors contributing to tensions among communities. Therefore, it has been proposed to establish a National Land Commission to prepare a proper land use policy, taking into consideration historical and archaeological factors. Also, making it mandatory for Sinhalese medium students to learn Tamil and Tamil medium students to learn Sinhalese with the full support of the state is another step that will contribute towards reconciliation and national harmony. So taking preemptive action against religious, ethnic, or other forms of extremism to take root in the country to ensure that every citizen, regardless of ethnicity or religious belief, is able to live in without fear in Sri Lanka is also proposed as another group of measures that will be taken by the government. I want to focus a little bit on the international challenges or the focus on what the government intends to do internationally. So the president has advocated a foreign policy based on neutrality, non-alignment, mutual friendship, and trust among nations. So what has been said is that as a policy, we will maintain equidistant and yet cordial relations with all countries and remain neutral in the power struggles among nations. And I also appeal to all global leaders to respect the sovereignty and unitary status of Sri Lanka. This is what the president said after the election. Sri Lanka has a long history of cooperation with the international community, and President Rajapaksa in the past few months has remained engaged with our partners despite the restriction placed by the pandemic on face-to-face engagements. There is also renewed vigor and interest within the international community to work with the new government. Our challenge would be to ensure that we derive what is best for Sri Lanka in a globally challenging situation. Most critically, Sri Lanka, given its geostrategic location in the Indian Ocean, is of course of significant interest to many players. However, the government has reiterated that it will not be a playground for power struggles between major powers. And the government has also reiterated that Sri Lanka would not allow another country to use our soil to attack the interests of a third country. While Sri Lanka is open to anyone who is able to bring foreign investments to the country, the president also has categorically stated that he will not give total control of national strategic assets to any foreign country. In the Human Rights Council, the government withdrew its co-sponsorship of Resolution 30/1 and 40/1 in February of this year. And at the time, Foreign Minister Gotabaya, when he addressed the Human Rights Council, said, while we follow a non-aligned neutral foreign policy, the government is committed to examining issues afresh, to forge ahead with its agenda for prosperity through security and development, and to find homegrown solutions to overcome contemporary challenges in the best interests of all Sri Lankans. Thank you very much for the invitation given to me to make some opening remarks, and I would be happy to answer questions if there are any. Thank you very much.
Thank you, High Commissioner. Thank you very much. You really set out the whole agenda for us. You told us the context the special context in which the election had to take place. You told us about the outcome. You told us about the agenda for the new government. You told us a bit about the structure of the new government and some of its key objectives in the days ahead. So we're really grateful for you for joining us. And this is the first time we're having a formal engagement with you. So thank you very much. Since you have actually set the whole agenda, and I think our participants, our panelists now will have a good, framework to which they can respond. But before they start, I just wanted to say a word about the Institute for South Asian Studies. ISAS was set up in 2004 with the mandate to study contemporary political, economic, and security and international relations of South Asia. We, by nature of the geography, I think India takes up a lot of our mind space and the work, but we continue to strive to do as much as we can on the other countries. I'm not saying smaller countries, I'm saying the other countries, that each one of them has a unique position in the world. Many of them have international profiles which are significant. And therefore, for us to be able to think of the region in much broader terms is very, very important. And that's where I want to thank the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Because of their support, we've been able to do a lot more programs. The Singapore program looks at the region as a whole. So therefore, they've been wonderful partners for us to look at the various countries in South Asia. So I would just say that you talked about the historic opportunity here for the new government, having a strong government which can do things, and your president has a reputation of being a doer. So I think that opens up a whole range of possibilities for the rest of the international community to engage you. And my sense is Sri Lanka is not just a South Asian country, it is an Indian Ocean country. It is located in the heart of the Indian Ocean. And it was also among the first in South Asia to really connect with Southeast Asia. And there is a long story. So I think there is deep interest in Singapore and in Southeast Asia to engage the new government and to see where the region can take the economic and other partnerships with Sri Lanka. So I will stop here and ask each of my colleagues on the panel to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. So now we've really, I think you have an easy way of addressing the issues involved. So no more than 10 minutes, and if you can do it in 8 minutes, it'll be wonderful. So we have 4 panelists dealing with different aspects of the situation in Sri Lanka. And after that, we'll open it up for discussion. So Dr. Chulani Atanaike is a colleague at ISAS, and she's going to talk about the domestic dynamics.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you, Madam High Commissioner, for a very detailed and excellent context. It made my job quite easy, to be honest. So I don't think I will take a lot of time because many of the points is already covered. I will basically explain the political trends that has formed during this period of time because I think this election and not just this election, since a presidential election last year, Sri Lanka sees a new political trend in the country. So let me begin with commending the Sri Lankan population for believing in their democratic rights. So the election held after a lot of difficulties. It was postponed twice due to the pandemic, and then there were numerous internal conflicts within major political parties that were out there. So it would have been a reason for the people to be more demotivated about the system in the country, but they managed to come out and vote, and so in this context, I think 70 plus voter turnout is quite commendable. So, which shows that Sri Lankan people's interest in practicing their democratic rights. And also, I agree with the High Commissioner. I think people have viewed President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's leadership with quite positivity, which so they seems to have faith in his leadership, which is shown in a outstanding victory for the SLPP. So what I noticed during this election was that the political configuration is not that different from what it was in 2019, but the dividing lines were much more clearer in this election. As we all, most of us know that Sri Lanka is a multi-party democracy, but the contest of an election has always been between UMP and SLPP. But this election saw that the breakaway groups of UMP and SLFP are leading the competition, which marked the end of Sri Lanka's oldest political parties. So, which means that perhaps the way the two oldest political parties have failed to reach out to the public and understand the voters' interest. So they have found new breakaway groups much more appealing and understanding their cause. So I see that this election was held in a context where it is very advantageous for SLPP. SLPP's popularity is in at its highest stage. They leveraged its popularity by following its two consecutive victories in 2018 local government election and 2019 presidential election. And the environment was quite advantaged to the SLPP. The SLPP government is in a honeymoon period, so their response to people's concern and demands are at all-time high. So, for instance, the past few months saw how President Gotabaya make swift and timely decision to curb the pandemic, and then there are many other decisions that attracted the public's gained public's notice, as High Commissioner already informed. And we saw that there's an anti-drug campaign and crushing of the underworld, which is commended by the public, because disciplined and respectable society was one of the main election promises. So there is a progress in delivering the election promises during the past few months, which was a progressive measure. And also, I think the anti-incumbency feeling against the previous regime is still fresh within the mindset of the people, even though SJB, Samagi Jana Balavega, which is now the main opposition party, and the breakaway group of UNP, headed by Sajid Premadasa, even though that they emerged as a new party, many of its members were holding ministerial portfolios in the previous government. So it looks like the public is not ready yet to forget the ways that they failed to deliver the promises. So that could be a result that also have paid in advantage for the SLPP government. And also, opposition was largely divided. So soon after the presidential election defeat in November, the frictions within the UMP became more visible. There's Ranil fraction and Sajid's fraction, and they continued the blame game for the failure or the defeat at the election, presidential election, rather than looking at what they should be doing in order to make a strong comeback. So people felt demotivated and disappointed. So when we look at the numbers and the numbers have reduced, we see partly that there is slight increase in SLPP's support for the SLPP, but there's a large absence in people who have voted. So perhaps the reduction in SJB and UMP together could be because their traditional supporters did not want to go to the polling station and cast their vote because of the friction within the party. So that is a major development. Then we saw that SJB signed a MOU with 12 political parties, and they managed to get to 23.9% of the voters with 54 seats. But compared to other opposition groups in the previous governments, they are relatively at a disadvantaged position. And then we also saw that Tamil parties, division within the Tamil party, TNA did not contest as an alliance. They contested as separate parties. So their vote base also got largely divided. And as Madam High Commissioner already explained, there was support for the parties that were supporting SLPP. So that you see that perhaps within the Tamil community also there's a change of the way they look at, there must be aligning a little bit with the national politics, looking at broader advantages, looking at economic development as a key concern for them rather than identity politics. And so, of course, the other major aspect is the demise of the older political parties, which we have to understand. So within SLP, from SLP managed to get 145 seats out of 150, which were required for a two-third government. So they managed to get a coalition, form a coalition with EPDP, TMVP, and SLFP. SLFP seat in Jaffna is quite interesting because they contested separately in Jaffna, and it is interesting to see that they got over 60,000 votes, which helped them to get a separate parliament seat. So what this election, I think, promised political stability for the country, and because we have seen that in the past, a government has to come into coalition with numerous parties in order to get a majority. So over a time, you fail to deliver election promises or make substantial policy changes because of the frictions within the coalition. So this time, since the strong majority is within SLPP, I think they will, that the political stability is ensured. And this resounding victory also comes with a responsibility, because not now the SLPP government cannot use not having a majority or ideological division within a coalition as a reason not to deliver. So the way they perform in the next 5 years will decide how Sri Lanka's public view Sri Lanka's politics, to what extent they will believe in the democratic system in the country. And I also want to start briefly about the constitutional amendment. I think from the during the presidential election and even now, the SLPP was very clear about their interest in abolishing the 19th Amendment. So, Madam High Commissioner already explained, like the cabinet has already given green light to go ahead with this, and then it will be based on one country, one law. So I think partly the idea is there are different fractions within communities who demand separate laws for their communities, so which the government believe can lead to division and further polarization. So I think one of the reasons for the one country, one law is that. And then there is a concern raised within different sectors whether this new constitution will further centralize the power, because that has been the experience in the past. But in a recent interview with a local news channel, Mr. Basil Rajapaksa, one of the key organizers of SLPP, informed that there will be no changes to the presidential term limits or to the independent commission. So I think the changes would be more into the electoral system and to remove other ambiguities. So that is basically the political trend that I observe. Thank you.
Thank you, Chilani. Thank you very much for sticking to time as well. So now let me invite Dr. Waha to talk about issues of state and society. Dr. Waha, the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. I would like to look into the challenges and the opportunities for the relations between the Sri Lankan state and the Sri Lankan society, which is following now the recent parliamentary elections. And in my very short perusal, I would like to highlight 3 points I consider very important, and 3 points which I think are significantly impacted by the new parliament. And the first one is the question of society's trust into the state. The second one is the question of the state's role in building social cohesion. And the final one is the question of building new foundations for the state. So first, let me come to the question of trust. The question of society's trust into the state, from my point of view, is very much linked to the trust into the central figures representing the state. And as was mentioned by the previous speakers before, already in the presidential election and also now in the parliamentary election, trust played a major role in the election's outcome, particularly the trust into the Rajapaksa's leadership skills and also the lacking trust into his political opponents, particularly UNP and SJP. So I think we all can agree that there is little doubt that Gotabaya Rajapaksa is considered and trusted to be a skillful leader when it comes to questions of national security, terrorism, the COVID-19 crisis, and problem solving in general. But I think there is a different picture when it comes to trust into the Rajapaksa's take on democracy, nepotism, and clientelism. And I think particularly with regard to Gotabaya Rajapaksa, his links to the military, also seen in the alleged militarization of the state, which was claimed by members of the opposition and human rights organizations during the COVID-19 crisis, but also questions of accountability, etc., very much challenged the trust into Gotabaya Rajapaksa, but also in the institutions he represents. And also his, of course, close relation to his brother Mahinda is also problematic because it challenged the trust that the state institutions are there to serve the people first and more the people rather than the politicians. So I think this is a great challenge. And now after the election, I think the fear has risen that there is now the end of the honeymoon phase after the Rajapaksas got the majority they wanted, and that they would now start to expand their powers and start to position supporters in central states in the state, in the economy, but also in educational institutions. And I think in this regard, it is essential for the government to keep up trust into the government and into the state by providing transparency. That means explaining decisions taken, explaining the posts given, and also being open to the media despite the troubled relationships also to international and local media outlets. So I think in this regard, transparency will be crucial in upholding trust into the state as well as in the government. The second question is the question of the state's role in building social cohesion. We see that there has been an increasing polarization of the society, which on the one hand builds on unresolved issues of competing Tamil and Sinhalese nationalisms, but also questions of representation and power distribution. And while this contestation of identity and representation between Sinhalese and Tamils is not new, it escalated into war between the LTTE and the government of Sri Lanka. Since the end of the war, this contentious issues are expanded around questions of accountability, human rights violations during the war and the like. And on the one hand, from a minorities, particularly Tamil's perspective, this regards the military and Gotabaya Rajapaksa, but I think it's important to also see the other side, the Sinhalese Buddhist side mainly, and also the Muslim side when it comes to accountability of former LTTE fighters and former members of the LTTE, also figures like Karuna who came into ordinary politics after being part of this terrorist organization. And also the question of an LTTE rising again, I think will impact the relation between different groups in the society. There have been activities abroad, and the question of how the state can and how the state must respond is very, very important. On the one hand, it needs to provide security. On the other hand, it needs to prevent further Tamil alienation from the state. But also when it comes to Muslims, we see that there is an increasing alienation from the state and radicalization among the Muslim population. This issue, again, is not entirely new. There have been identity conflicts already around independence and early state formation processes, but the relations of the Muslim communities to other communities significantly worsened in the recent years. And the increasing radicalization of this group, growing Islamist extremism, and also the spreading of fundamentalism, which has started first in the East following the frequent LTTE attacks on the Muslim communities there, but also the exclusion from peace negotiations, foreign influences, also very much after the tsunami in 2004, and also the wider expansion of Wahhabism and the growing distrust in the Muslim political elite by the Muslim people accounts into this problem. And in this regard, I think the Easter Sunday attacks are a symptom, not the cause of the current issue, but we have to see that they very much served as a catalyst, expanding this conflict into the wider society. And also we see that growingly there are narratives spreading of large-scale discrimination of the Muslims by the state. Certain topics are blown up, international press like Al Jazeera is involved, and also social media plays a crucial role. And in this regard, the state agents will be central. Both the Buddhist and the Muslim groups are dissatisfied. And as was mentioned before, in this context, the question of one people, one law will come up. We have seen that there is a rejection of separate laws, like the Muslim marriage law, within the population. There have been protests and there have been clashes between radical fringes of the Buddhist and the Muslim community. But also in the current COVID-19 crisis, we have seen that the burning of corpses, which was for all people alike during the pandemic, were followed by allegations of discrimination and the suppression of religious freedom. And with regard to the relations of the Muslim communities to the other communities, this is, I think, a sign for a very dangerous path which has been taken. On the other hand, we see that Rajapaksa and the SLLP are both close to long-standing Buddhist demands. And this will, from my point of view, pose a very great opportunity for the state to become more stable. They seek to strengthening the Buddhism's place in the society. They seek to strengthen the financial resources of temples and the Sangha. They are trying to also support the bhikkhunis, the order of the nuns. And I think this have been demands of politically active Buddhist monks and Buddhists alike. And this, I think, will provide an opportunity to end the insecurity and the permanent threat perception which is held by the Sinhalese Buddhist majority. And this will serve as a basis for a more resilient majority, also to attempts to radicalize them and to increase the hatred against other communities. But still, I think the question remains how neutral the new government can be in brokering relations between the different communities. As I said, they have a close relationship to the Buddhist society. Furthermore, I think it's important to notice that the increasing polarization of the society is not only limited to ethnic or religious identities, but also to questions of class, caste, income, and education. And when we hear in particularly the economically lower stratas in Colombo and around, we see and hear that there is a fear that under the new government, the new Colombo port city will be a place for the rich and the rest of Colombo will be turned into a place of the poor and will be neglected thereafter. And I think in this context, we also need to raise the question how openly these rifts will be discussed and treated by the new government. And the next question is the question of new foundations. We have heard it before by the previous speakers and the High Commissioner that there is the debate about the new constitution. I think currently the debate has focused mainly on the 19th Amendment and the claim that in case of a 2/3 majority, the Rajapaksas would repeal it to extend their powers. But from my point of view, it's not only about the 19th Amendment. The SLPP did not present an own election manifesto, but referred to Gotabaya Rajapaksa's election manifesto. And in this election manifesto, we see that there is one central point, that is the new constitution. And this, as we heard by the High Commissioner before, was also confirmed by Gotabaya Rajapaksa in his address to the new Parliament's inaugural session yesterday. And in the election manifesto, as well in the speech, we hear that the 19th constitutional amendment is considered to have led to the disruption of the smooth functioning of the government, led to public outrage, and that now a new constitution is needed, which reflects the aspirations of our people. So, and there are certain central elements in this demanded new constitution, which are very essential and linked to the history of Sri Lanka. There's one, the unitary state, which is very essential for the Buddhist political strata. That means the state is central, it's non-divided and non-federal, which on the other hand is also very critical for the Tamil people in the north and the east. Buddhism is given the foremost place, and as was mentioned frequently by the previous speakers, it will focus on one law for one people. And as I said, these issues have been contested for decades between different groups in the society. But if this constitutional change will be properly done, I think it can lay a really good basis for the solving of such identity issues on the long run. And it's really dearly needed to overcome the identity politics in Sri Lanka, which have hindered the economic development of this country so much for years. But I think on the other hand, on the short run, it will lead to conflict, particularly in a situation where so many religious identities are politicized, also in the case of the Muslim identity, which increasingly gets foreign support, also from terrorist organizations like the Islamic State. And furthermore, I think there is the question whether the new government will have the trust by the minorities that this new institution, which is about to be implemented, will not be turned against their interest. Furthermore, the past has proven that there is a great difficulty of bringing different groups in to participate in writing the constitution. And I think it will not be possible to bring all representatives of all various factions in. But I think what in this context is really essential, again, is the transparency of the government and the openness about what is coming, what is changing, and what it will mean for the people. I think that is really essential. And from my point of view, we have great opportunities to overcome identity politics, as I said, but we also have challenges when it comes to the trust into the government by the minorities, and these problems have to be addressed. And from my point of view, these are the major challenges and opportunities ahead regarding the relation of state and society in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Waha. Now we will move from the state and society issues to the economic issues. Dr. Palit, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Rajamohan, and thank you to the Institute of South Asian Studies and the KAS for inviting me to speak at this extremely significant discussion on the Sri Lankan state following the latest elections. Let me begin by sharing with you a little bit of the character of the Sri Lankan economy at this point in time. I'm not going to go into numbers specifically. I think we are all aware of the fact that across the world, particularly in the South Asian region, there is a very steep economic contraction which is being experienced as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and its resultant impact. In Sri Lanka's case, there is relatively greater concern about not the COVID-19 or its resultant impact, which is probably more short-term, probably more cyclical in nature. But the deeper concern is with respect to the structural problems that the economy is facing. And these, in a sense, reflect on a fairly troublesome macroeconomic scenario for the country. And let me very briefly take you through this. I would highlight two particular areas of specific concern for the Sri Lankan economy. The first is its high external debt. Now, high external debt has been a recurrent feature of the Sri Lankan economy for quite some time now. There has been oscillations in the volume of debt as a proportion of GDP. At this point in time, the debt-GDP ratio is likely to go beyond 90% in the current year, 2020. These are the estimations that are coming out of the Fitch credit rating agency. The challenge for Sri Lanka in this regard, and this is a specific challenge with respect to the rest of the South Asian region, is that the amount of external debt which is held by Sri Lanka as a part of its total public debt is disproportionately high. And there are some comparative numbers which would make this situation pretty much clear. Like if one looks at a country like Bangladesh, for example, Bangladesh's external debt GDP ratio is 12%. If one looks at Nepal, it's 16%. If one looks at a country like India, 19%. For even Maldives and Pakistan, for Pakistan, it's 39%, but for Sri Lanka, it's nearly 60% of the total debt that it is holding. Now, what that means is that the debt servicing obligation for the Sri Lankan economy is remarkably high. Why has it come to this kind of a stage? Probably there are views with respect to why the Sri Lankan economy has eventually become almost hostage to the external debt obligations that binds it to the external financial situation across the world. But without getting into that, I think the biggest challenge that comes up for Sri Lanka right now is the debt servicing obligations that we would have to encounter during the period 2021 to 2025. On an average, these are expected to be more than $4 billion per year. This is assuming exchange rates remain where they are right now. And this, when combined with the fact that the Sri Lankan foreign exchange reserves are not particularly high, which as of now are at around $6.6 billion, what it essentially means that the ability of the reserves to take care of the debt servicing obligations are increasingly going to be tested, and it's going to become more and more marginal over time, unless and until Sri Lanka is able to really replenish the foreign exchange reserves in a substantive fashion. How it can do that is a different question, but this is one of the reasons which is really preoccupying a large number of external watchers looking at the Sri Lankan macroeconomy, and this is probably one of the reasons for which the credit rating agencies are actually in the process of either revising Sri Lanka's credit rating outlook or having revised it already, as the Fitch has done from B to B minus. The second macroeconomic challenge that confronts Sri Lanka at this point in time is the rising level of budget deficit. Now, the budget deficit, according to the latest report, which the Ministry of Finance brought out in the month of April, was around 8.5% of GDP, but there are expectations it's going to increase to more than 9%. And this is largely because of the lower performance of the economy and the ability to generate substantive revenues. Combined with an external debt, which is unsustainably high, and a poor budget deficit condition, the challenges for the Sri Lankan economy are actually substantial, and this is political regime neutral. Whichever regime now rules Sri Lanka for the foreseeable period has to actually take very hard decisions, and I would like to allude to a phrase that Madam High Commissioner mentioned in her speech, that the government really has to think out of the box in producing solutions that will control the situation. So I would just leave you with three thoughts at this stage. When it comes to the external debt management, what are Sri Lanka's options? Unfortunately, the conversation and the discussion with the IMF has not really produced very satisfactorily at this point in time. But the only option that Sri Lanka has at this stage appears to be to switch debts, shifting them from the more expensive contractual debts to less expensive debt over a period of time, so that it gets some breathing space in this regard. It has to probably go back to the multilateral donors, or even if those are bilateral donors, those have to be at softer rates. There has to be the second point of defense. There has to be mobilization of sufficient internal resources, primarily revenues. There is not much option in increasing revenues, but what Sri Lanka really needs to do is focus on cutting down expenditure through hard structural reforms, and these probably would mean looking very closely at the ways in which the state-owned enterprises can be reformed. And finally, my last point, if the foreign exchange reserves need to be replenished and need to be sustained over a point in time into the foreseeable future, Sri Lanka needs to look at attracting non-debt creating sources of foreign exchange. And those have to be long-term foreign direct investment, which are committed to the economy and statehood. But at this point in time, long-term non-debt creating financial flows in the world are a rarity due to COVID-19. It's going to be a challenge for Sri Lanka to handle these substantive issues. I'm happy to discuss these issues further as we go ahead. And let me return you back to Professor Rajamohan.
Thanks, Amitelu, for that brief but sharp points. Now, let me call Dr. Gunashekara, Asanga Gunashekara, who is the former Director General of the Defense Institute in Colombo. Asanga, the floor is yours, 10 minutes.
Thank you, thank you. I would like to thank ISIS and CAS for the invitation. I have some slides, so I could share that. Is it visible to everyone? Yes. Yes. So I will speak about the international as well as the security challenges that Gotabaya Rajapaksa will face. So focusing on this foreign policy from well, starting from Mahinda Chintana which is 2005-15, his brothers. Is there a difference between the two brothers? The China factor and the triple sphere of influence, and under Gotabaya Rajapaksa's leadership. So how is he going to sort of balance and balancing the triple spheres? And I see a triple security challenge for the nation. It's actually a different environment from his brother Mahinda Rajapaksa's, a more competitive environment, as clearly written by Raja Mohan in his book. The powers are looking at oceans beyond their immediate neighborhood, and this is quite visible. Even if you look at the exercise, the joint exercise, the Malabar exercise, the quadrilateral expansion, Australia, Japan, you would see significant geopolitical tension in the island's vicinity, and in the China tension in the north, spreading actually to the south in the Indian Ocean. The heightened US-China relations, termed as Cold War 2.0, and also how does Sri Lanka looking at involved in BRI and also in the Pacific? How do you sort of manage this? And so it is a much more competitive environment for Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Let me quote Wang Yi, the foreign minister, Chinese foreign minister. He mentions clearly that unilateralism and bullying are forcing the way in the world, and international disorder is more possible than ever. You see tit for tat shutting of consulates in Houston as well as in China. So it is termed as a political virus by the minister. So you see a significant tension between the US and China. And when you look at the Sri Lankan case of successful COVID-19 by Gotabaya Rajapaksa and how he handled it, I mean, it was remarkable leadership given by him. But we are not blame China or sort of mention anything on China, but we have got multiple assistance from China to fight the virus. So if you look at the Srikant Kondapilli, he mentions the Indian scholar, the Chinese assertiveness and aggressiveness responses have been a bit to cover up the COVID-19 disaster. I don't see it like that. It is not a bit to cover up the COVID-19 disaster. The presence of multiple geographies and the assertiveness, if you look at it, is actually China making this geopolitical in the competition, clearly sending a message across to the rest of the world. If you look at the recent developments of Gotabaya Rajapaksa's presidency, the East Container Terminal, which is a tripartite agreement with Japan, India and Sri Lanka, is under review. The Matala Airport lease, which is with India, it's not on discussion now. USMCC, the Millennium Challenge Compact grant is on hold. US SOFA, Status of Forces Agreement, is on hold. The government has pulled out from the UN HRC resolution. So you would see the last 5 years of different foreign ministers in giving different messages at the global arena, inconsistency in that policy. So Gotabaya Rajapaksa's leadership is essential and is important, pivotal at this moment to bring consistency and to be clear on what his thoughts are on the foreign policy. So he has made it clear. I've come to that. China is not behind any of this doing on basically on if you look at MCC or so forth. So there are many speculative pieces saying that China is behind this. No, China is not. But has his moves drifted Sri Lanka towards China? Yes. Now that is, I would say, yes, much closer. And this is, I discuss this further in my new book, which is coming out end of the year. And so we see Gotabaya Rajapaksa's leadership and trust on COVID, security and foreign relations. People have actually had tremendous trust on him and voted. There are higher expectations from the general public from these elections. And there is a higher volatility of Sri Lankan voter base right now swing from one side to the other in a very short time. And if you look at it, the two foreign policies, Mahinda Chintane, more focus on non-alignment and non-aligned. So you have Gotabaya Rajapaksa, as High Commissioner mentioned, Excellency mentioned that it's an equidistant foreign policy clearly articulated. But the closer distance in geography to India is a question, because when you have equidistance, India's closeness and geography is a question. So I would rather see it as a multi-aligned foreign policy emerging in Sri Lanka. So Sri Lankan Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa clearly, with his 5 decades of political experience, has expressed that we do not wish to get entangled in big power struggles in the region. But will the powers leave Rajapaksas alone? And that's a question that should be asking. Now, continuation of is the Mahinda Rajapaksa's same foreign policy forward? I think yes, there is a continuation of it. But there is a recalibration of Indo-Lanka relations by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa because of the last year of Rajapaksa's. We could look at the it was strained, the relationship of Mahinda Rajapaksa, and also the two presidents, we were Maitripala Sirisena. Also, it was a very strained relationship with assassination plots and various others. So on the Eastern Terminal coming up. So this is it is a strained relationship. Will be recalibrated by Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Now, he has proven it during the last 9 months, and that the strong relationship, his visit to India, and promising to strengthen the bilateral relationship. It shouldn't be just rhetoric, but there should be action on these areas. Tamilian grievances is a concern, and the devolution, 13th Amendment, which 13th Amendment Plus was promised by his brother. These are areas to be looked at. UNHRC, Sri Lanka has pulled out, but I would suggest to amend rather than pulling out and working towards it. Reconciliation and diaspora re-engagement is another area to look at. Growing China factor, yes, India is concerned of the growing Chinese factor. The 5G network proposal in Sri Lanka. Now, if you look at Maldives, has implemented the 5G network of Huawei. So with Sri Lanka looking. So all these projects that are coming up is a concern when the heightened power projection, the big power rivalry heightens up. Domestic political landscape is really important in here, as Time magazine and most of the media has highlighted on sibling rivalries as well as democratic, the less democracy. I mean, before they have even started work, before Mahinda Rajapaksa has sworn in as a prime minister, there was already the media has mentioned. So it is a concern when you have a majoritarian government that it will swing towards a semi-autocratic model in South Asia, especially. Now, next financial capital, this is quite interesting, and this came out in the election manifesto, as well as the agenda of Namal Rajapaksa, saying that he would make it the next financial capital of Sri Lanka. Now, is that possible in the long run? Is it a possibility? While many say that this is, this is not a possibility. I mean, there will be much obstacles, as well as you wouldn't be able to make it the next financial hub. But I see as a possibility with the Rajapaksa leadership. Basically, India's neighborhood first policy, as the Foreign Minister clearly mentioned, S. Jaishankar, he clearly says that to focus much more on the neighborhood first, not just an issue of intent, it is even more of delivery for good measures that will be compared with the performance of China. So it is important to focus on the infrastructure of the neighborhood. I know there are technical issues with neighboring countries, the immediate neighbor, Nepal, Bangladesh, many other countries. But in Sri Lanka, yes, there could be more investment in the infrastructure, not limiting to rhetoric, but actually doing the work. The US sphere of influence is also significant with, the status of force agreement being held up. As you know, the Indo-Pacific report clearly mentions Sri Lanka, the second highest quoted country is Sri Lanka in the report. The MCC on hold, it's a grant, so on looking at it from the national security perspective, then the committee, presidential commission, appointed by Gotabaya Rajapaksa has sort of held the development aid, but it should be amended and taken forward. East Container Terminal is another area to be looked at. Promoting democracy and human rights agenda, US is directly involved in it and is advocating. It's all about, it has come to, I quote Parakan on sovereignty and transparency. You see, the slightest maneuver to threaten sovereignty can bring down a government, and this is from Parag's work. Debt trap, I think I agree with Amitendu, who just clearly mentioned although our ISB, international sovereign bonds, are much higher than the Chinese, the borrowings. But if you look at the total debt servicing seen as a hostage, we are at a serious economic situation right now. I mean, with the global recession, how are we going to sort of face it? Now, looking at how we sort of gave the infrastructure back, 5-10 years back, Sri Lanka had some capacity to bargain, but did not fully exert it, I think. China is in need of a strategic location in the Indian Ocean to secure its energy transportation. It's very clear to all of our nations. The centralized nature of governance left little room for a competitive bidding process or public opinion on these matters. So you need to move out of this at least now, and Sri Lanka could and should use basically its location as a bargaining advantage for a better term. If Sri Lanka had more fallback options in place, it would have got a better deal from China. The absence of an alternative makes China the dominant player. So facilitating infrastructure projects, any of these China, US, or India can be used as a bargaining leverage by the host country to gain additional benefits at the expense of a strategic and political risk associated for intensified competition. So this is a final slide I have on balancing the triple sphere of influence and the triple security threats. So balancing the infrastructure diplomacy in the island is key. UNHRC, as well as reconciliation with the diaspora re-engagement strategy is pivotal, and it's really important. On preserving geopolitical equilibrium, Sri Lanka can play an active contributing role for a rules-based order in the Indian Ocean. And on the political environment, you see, when you have a majoritarian government, transparency and sovereignty is really important. More transparent and if you look at it, malign mercantilism could come into the government. So you should sort of try to be semi-autocratic and work towards on the 20th Amendment with devolution in mind, and devolution and democracy. So democracy here, executive and the legislature, since it belongs for the first time in the Sri Lankan history to the siblings, checks and balances and separation of power should be a priority. And on the security, there's three threats I see. The growing extremist terrorism in the region, as you know from 2019 bombing, there is a significant extremist terrorism in the region that we need to look into. The Elam ideology would continue if there's no solution from on the devolution as well as on the grievances of the Tamilian. The external geopolitical fissures and and balancing the foreign policy is the last the threat, I would say. If you don't balance really well, so you have a definite significant security threat coming into the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Asanga. I think we've covered a lot of ground there. Jordan, can you move this shared screen so that we can? So I'm going to break the protocol somewhat and just We have Dr. Christian Wagner from Berlin, who is at SWP, also an expert on Sri Lanka. So I'm just going to ask him just to offer a brief comment on what he's heard so far. And then, meanwhile, I'll request all the colleagues in the audience, please send in your questions to the chat box, and we will take them and go back to the panel. So Christian, are you there? And maybe just for a few minutes, just to respond to the panel in some sense. Can someone unmute him, please? Is there?
Yes, okay. So thank you very much, Raja. Good morning from Germany to everybody. First of all, let me thank you very much for the short invitation. Let me thank ISAS for this wonderful event, and also thank all the presenters so far for their excellent and very comprehensive presentations. I had some technical problems here, so unfortunately I couldn't follow all the interventions. Let me make, let's say, 2 remarks on what I heard so far and how we may see this election in the future. One remark on the domestic constellation and one on the international aspects of this election. I wonder if we look back in a couple of years to this election in 2020, in how far it may be, let's say, the start of a very interesting and very fundamental transformation of the Sri Lankan political system, maybe similar, maybe a watershed election similar to what we have seen in 1956. Why do I raise the point? It has mentioned by various presenters that we have seen a very fundamental political shift in the party system. And I think this is, for me, the most interesting domestic development. And we may have seen new elites coming up. I mean, I cannot imagine following a Sri Lankan election over the last 30 years without the power struggle between UNP and the SLFP. Nowadays, both parties have nearly vanished. So I wonder in how far this also signals a very fundamental shift on the elite side, from the traditional political elites, which were centered around the traditional families, which have shaped the political history, as you all know, to new elites. So I wonder, and this would also be my question to the presenters, in how far this is this could be the start of a new permanent structure in the political system, or it's just a temporary event. Also, what is even more striking is the changes on the side of the minorities. I have worked on the Muslim community for quite some time. I have followed the Muslim community becoming a political party in this very early stage. Now we have seen a restructuring of political developments also on the side of minorities, not only on the Muslims, yes, which I have looked at it at some time, but more importantly, as was also mentioned, on the side of the Tamil community. So I wonder in how far we may also see a new political forces, a restructuring of political forces, which have shaped political development since independence, now to new parties, to new players, which may have a very different agenda and which may also then bring in very different demands on their side. So this is in how far this is really a fundamental change, or is it just a temporary event which is linked to the weakness of the opposition, which is linked to the strengths of the Rajapaksa family? And when the Rajapaksa family is gone, we go back to SLFP and UNP rule, as we have seen since 1948. On the international side, I would totally agree with what Asanga raised and what has also been mentioned by others about the China factor. But I think, especially when we look at Sri Lanka and we look at India-Sri Lankan relations, I think there's also an Indian factor in the domestic development in Sri Lanka. I think it has been mentioned that at the moment the 13th Amendment is still the main basis for the political solution. So I wonder in what role will India play in the future debate on minority issues. India is heavily supporting projects in the north and east, so it is focusing on the Tamil areas. So I wonder in how far, when we have a new constitution in Sri Lanka, also this minority issue may resonate in India, especially in the southern part of India, in Tamil Nadu, where the Tamils still also always had some support. So I wonder in how far this may add another layer to the geopolitical rivalries, which is not strictly a geopolitical race between India and Sri Lanka and their spheres of influence in the Indian Ocean. But the Sri Lankan case may be special because it will also link domestic developments in Sri Lanka with domestic political development in India. And this will certainly add another and a very complex and very complicated layer to this geopolitical race between India and China in the Indian Ocean. So I will stop here. Let me thank you very much for the presenters again. Let me also thank you for my short intervention, and I look forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you for that. And thank you for making it even more complicated than it already is. And wonderful seeing you out here. So there are, at least a few questions that have come up. And one is the question of globalization, that the assumption all of us have made over the years is really everyone globalizes. I mean, South Asia probably was among the last to, probably a little earlier than Indochina or Burma, but otherwise among the last. And the assumption that, look, globalization is here to stay and we're going to be engaged with everyone in the world. Now, given the pressures on deglobalization today, the US-China conflict, so this is not about spheres of influence, actually this is far more economic. Asanga talked about these spheres of influence on the security side, but on the economic side. So the question from one of our colleagues is, look, there is now a new debate in Asia. Do you tie into China and this supply chains linked to China, or do you come out and do things differently? So I think it is just at the beginning of a debate. So the two issues here. What would be the new government's attitude towards globalization? I mean, that is it open-ended and assumes that things are going to be the same, therefore they just do the same things, or there is a new international context, so how do they relate to that? The second aspect is specifically in the case of China, that does it, like in Pakistan, seems to be making a clear choice to integrate more deeply with China. Will that be the choice of Sri Lanka, or would it actually seek more wider choices? So I think it's speculative at this moment, but I think it relates to two major developments that are taking place. So the question is addressed to all of you. So I don't know which one you want to start first. Amitabh, you want to go first? You are the trade guy.
Thank you, Raja. I think one of the problems that needs to be appreciated at this juncture is that this was even visible during the previous Sri Lankan government. There was a certain degree of hesitation in engaging in trade policies. And the biggest example of that is probably the issues surrounding the Sri Lanka-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. The government had on a number of occasions suggested that it is well ahead on the way to finishing FTAs with both India and China. Those haven't really materialized. And today, the biggest problem for Sri Lanka is that the room for maneuver on managing the macroeconomic situation is very limited. And at this stage, I would take a position that Sri Lanka has to take risks, and those risks might also involve some compromise in strategic autonomy. I don't really see much alternative for Sri Lanka other than getting pushed into a position where the international credit and aid environment is split into blocks between the West and the pro-China blocks. In that kind of a situation, even negotiating an IMF arrangement is going to be tricky. There's going to be a price that has to be paid for it. Sri Lanka's biggest advantage is its geography. It can play an incredibly important role in repositioning of supply chains. But unfortunately, it has not been a part of that conversation. So I really think that one of the issues that we have been facing across South Asia is the fact that you mentioned deglobalization, Raja, but I think along with deglobalization, the huge concern has been that there has probably been a more than proportional emphasis on local, national, sub-regional issues, which are of a more petty political character, as opposed to the much bigger challenges which these countries and their economies are encountering. I think it's high time Sri Lanka needs to go back there on really an emergency basis to see what best it can do.
Thank you. I think your microphone, is creating some your problems. But anyway, I want to go back to the other panelists. I mean, anyone, Christian, you want to come in, or Latoya, Asanga, anyone on this issue of global economy? Yeah. Okay, I'll start with Christian. You're muted, Christian. Christian, you're muted. You're muted. Yeah. Open your mic. No, you have to click on your... Can you unmute?
Yes, now it works. The host somehow locks me off, so this creates sometimes problems. I think the globalization issue will become also, I think one should be clear, especially with regard to some main trading partners, the globalization issue will be linked to domestic developments. It will be linked, especially in the case of the European Union. Sri Lanka, as far as I know, still has a GSP plus agreement with the EU, and there is some close scrutiny on the developments in the country, and I think the human rights situation, the question of reconciliation will play a part. So it will depend on the position of the Sri Lankan government in how far they will be able to deal with this topic, because it may have also an economic backlash, and it may also, let's say, make the EU rethink whether it should further grant the GSP plus to Sri Lanka. So I think the human rights issue and the minority issue will certainly play a role in this equation. Thank you.
Hey, Latoya, you want to come in on this?
Yeah, thank you very much. I very much agree with Christian Wagner, because I think when we talk about globalization and the globalization of the Sri Lankan economy, we also have to look into domestic spheres, and particularly with regard to this government, into the question of continuing legitimacy. And particularly from the Buddhist side, there have been protests against Chinese influence, there have been protests against Western influences, and I think the government will need to take into account and need to consider these concerns about growing foreign influences into domestic spheres. And we have seen in the case of China, but also, as Christian Wagner mentioned, in the case of the European Union and the impact on the GSP plus agreements, we see that people are against the influences which are coming with the cooperation. So I very much agree with Christian Wagner that you cannot discuss globalization in economic terms in Sri Lanka without also looking at the domestic sphere and also looking in questions of legitimacy.
Chulani, you wanted to come in on this? Or?
Yes, Prof. I also think that, I mean, in Sri Lanka, it's quite like a tradition. Whenever a government, whether it's SLFP or UMP, whatever the government who goes for a trade agreement or any other kind of agreement, there's going to be always backlash from the public. So usually that has been the case for very many years. We see it during SEPA, we saw it when Sri Lanka signing agreements with China for various projects, and even just before the election with regard to ECT, Eastern Container Terminal. So this is going to be a recurring event. So it will be like to what extent the government is ready to take some of the decisions which might not be quite popular with the public. Are they ready to go that mile in order to make longer term policies? That would decide, I think, how government is responding to the globalization issue.
Asanga, you wanted to come in on this, on the economic choices?
Yes, thank you, Raja. I think the environment that we're living, the pandemic environment, has sort of moved. I mean, it's about discussing about more ultra-nationalists or more strong leaders in many countries. Sri Lanka is the same. So, but we should not allow the ultra-nationalism or nationalism going to malign mercantilism. So that's why we move more towards the global arena and towards globalization. So that is really important. And talking about regionalism, there's less discussion on regionalism right now. So it's very important that we talk about multilateralism, regionalism, not about China, but there are many other countries that Sri Lanka could trade with, and there are many supply chains that we could establish. But China is taking, if you look at the recent Brookings India report, China is taking a significant portion out of South Asia, is doing really well. So there are many other countries also who do more things, but it's a caution that the government should not move towards malign mercantilism.
Thank you. There's another question on the human rights issues. I mean, just as the international environment on economic integration has changed, there is also the question. I think the question is saying, look, it's not the same world when it comes to human rights. I mean, there is a certain ennui, certain wariness in the West. Trump, of course, put it completely on the back seat. Today, I heard Biden's acceptance speech. Of course, they're going to come back on human rights. But the ability to really pursue that, given the messy global situation, that is, I mean, it looks rather hard compared to the pure manner in which post-1991 the world could follow, at least the West could impose certain human rights standards. So there is today, I think there is probably less political will to go at human rights issues everywhere. I mean, I think that would seem harder today. I mean, I could be wrong on that, but of course, it's country by country. It's easy to be tough on Burma than on China. Probably it's easier to be tough on smaller countries than on big countries. But the question, but still, I think we are past the peak. So therefore, if that is the case, does that give Colombo a chance? I mean, in a sense, not to be part of the kind of debates that were there for the last 20 odd years, but to be creative internally in a manner that it is seen as making progress. And that would actually use these slightly different international environment to be able to seen as moving domestically so that it can make a virtuous cycle out of it. I mean, of course, when you're a strong government with some creative elements, you can do this, but I'm not sure that's where it is going. So maybe we'll just go around. Asanga, you want to start, and then I'll go the other way quickly.
Yeah, Raja, while I agree with you on the global context, but in the Sri Lankan context, it's been from 2015, there are 3 foreign ministers going back to back and saying 3 different things at the Human Rights Council. So one minister went and did a co-sponsorship. The other minister went and said, we can go up to a certain limit. So it is a domestic issue, I would say. Wagner actually rightly pointed out the minority issues will resonate if you do not address it and from the constitution. So that is another serious concern. I would also see if the 20th Amendment it does not capture it. Human rights, I think, rather than walking out, make amendments, face it, be there, and it's much important. The Sri Lankan case is unique. It is not. You cannot equate to other countries, to Burma, to other nations. Many scholars have tried to do that, but that is wrong. It is a different context. We faced a different civil war. It was a quite different context. So it has to be understood, and we need to face it. So I believe that the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government will face it and will sort of make the right amendments and address these issues and bring the diaspora closer to the country. So more diaspora re-engagement and work towards that on national reconciliation.
Yeah, Latoya? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I agree with Asanga, but I would also say that we have to see that in Sri Lanka there is a legitimacy issue of human rights as well. In the recent years, I mean, since say around 2000, the question of human rights has always been linked to the international community's influence in Sri Lanka. It has always been presented, and at times it has been true, that these issues were only taken up to be supportive of the Tamil people, to be supportive of the LTTE at times even. So in Sri Lanka, we see that many people understand or equal human rights with foreign influence and the way or the means used by the West to take influence in Sri Lanka. And I think that has to change. This perception has to be changed in Sri Lanka itself in order to be able to look at issues of human rights and in order to being able to also internationally pressure the government into questions of accountability and so forth. Because otherwise the government will either lose its own legitimacy if giving into the foreign demands with regard to human rights, or will just be able to ignore it, pointing out that it's just a means to take influence in the country and to take over control by foreign forces, as it has often been done. So I think first you have to really give back credibility to the question of human rights before we can really honestly discuss it in Sri Lanka.
Chulani, you want to say something? Opportunity or a crisis? I mean,
that's a very tricky way of putting it, Prof. But I think I agree with Dr. Latoya. In Sri Lanka has a twine problem. There's a issue within the country and there's an issue internationally. And the way the issue has been approached has created this dilemma. So I would say that one way would be to, as Dr. Latoya said, to create a legitimate discussion within the country, but also perhaps engage the international organizations in a different way. There are many organizations that Sri Lanka can approach in order to build its image, because right now Sri Lanka is equalized in certain ways. People associate Sri Lanka with either the human rights and the war or with China. So if Sri Lanka can use its, even though there's a discussion about a maritime identity and all that, we don't see that is being properly used to create an image. So if Sri Lanka at this point can do that using other international organizations, perhaps it can create a different image for itself while having a legitimate discussion within the country. So when that happens, I think it will be much more easier to join the international community as concerns and the domestic majority population's opinion about human rights.
Christian, since you mentioned Europe, GSP, I mean, I wonder with the stuff happening in Hungary and other places, how much bandwidth is there in Europe to deal with non-European issues on human rights when you have actually, in Europe itself, there are bigger human rights issues that are coming to the fore?
Mm-hmm. Yes, Raja, I think you are right that we have seen a sharp decline in the interest in dealing with human rights or using human rights or forms of democracy promotion, as we have seen in years before this. I think the Sri Lankan case is very special because I would somehow follow what Latoya and Chulani said, somehow add another dimension to it. I think, yes, legitimacy issue is an important topic, but I wonder in how far we may also see in Sri Lanka a debate coming up about, let's say, a Buddhist understanding of human rights. So what we have seen in other Asian countries, also that we may no longer see human rights in our traditional universal concept, but more in, let's say, cultural concept. And with this strong government, with the idea to write a new constitution, I wonder in how far this debate is going to set in, which will then somehow make the country immune. Second point, and I think, so there are three different layers. First is the cultural concept of human rights, which with such a majority, I think would not be too surprising if this debate would start. Second is the economic angle to human rights, as I mentioned in the GSP+. But as Sri Lanka may have now other alternatives, that is China, this kind of instrument is losing, of course, it's important. But there's also a third level, which is the report of the UN General Secretary. I mean, this is really another area or another level, because this is an international report by the UN General Secretary, which may be used, of course, by diaspora communities close to Tamil, Elam forms of ideology to always bring up this issue. And these are three different levels which are linked to human rights issues. And I think it will be very difficult for Sri Lankan government to really play all these three different and distinct levels in its foreign policy, because I think addressing the human rights issue and war crimes in the UN in the General Secretary report of the UN is quite a different issue compared to trade preferences with the EU. Thank you.
Well, that's an interesting way of putting it, I think. But it gives us a lot of thought to think about how the global debate on human rights itself might evolve in the coming years. But there was a specific question to Asanga on NGOs, not a very popular group in Sri Lanka, I believe. So the question is, what is where is the debate in Sri Lanka on foreign NGOs in particular? How does it relate to the rest of the world's debate? So in terms of if the government is redefining its national security approach, do they have a place, or is it going to get harder? Is it really marginal to the current dynamic in Colombo? Asanga, unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, well, NGOs are integral, part of the society. They played a pivotal, I would say, an important role in Sri Lankan politics, Sri Lankan society. So there has been, back in the past, incidents. But if you look at I think the security, from the security dimension, the issue was on basically on funding, mainly on their funding, and on AML and CFT, anti-money laundering, counterintelligence funding, and that sort of thing was on the security domain, and that's about it. And nothing on NGO funds being used for terrorism activity and that sort of thing. But other than that, I think that's something that Sri Lanka needs to improve on. I think you cannot sort of make us, during the immediate post-war, there was quite a bit of hostility towards the NGO on different programs, on different things that they were running. And I think that period is over. So Sri Lanka is sort of gone out of that period. And I think Gotabaya Rajapaksa's leadership, as well as the Prime Minister himself, I think he was a champion of NGOs. He was talking about NGOs. Back in 1989, he was the one who went to Geneva speaking about the human rights much more, the Prime Minister. So with his 5-decade experience, I think there will be more space for NGOs. And I hope things will change.
Thank you. I think there are a couple of questions. I'll just use that for all of you to make some final comments, very short, brief comments. I think one question is, is the political realignment Christian talked about, what kind of, there's a decimation of most parties except one. So how do you look at the realignment? Is there forces are going to combine, or is there going to be new parties coming up? So that's one question. The second is the kind of constitutional changes. I think one country, one law, maybe speculate a little bit in terms of how that could play out on the ground, but we only got a few minutes. So if all of you are very brief in responding to this, that'll be great. Let's start with Asanga, then briefly, maybe you want to just touch on these issues, political realignment and constitutional change. Sharply, 2 comments.
On constitutional change, I have written about it in my latest piece of the ORF. So basically, I have said it's like brain surgery. Take time and do not rush. But because this is something, are we moving towards a more secular nation, more sort of giving space to other ethnic groups, religious groups. So it's very, very important that Sri Lanka looks at it, because it's a country that had two revolutions, the uprisings in 1989, 1971, 30 years of civil war. So it's something very serious. Every sort of line that you sort of add to the devolution or against the minority would affect the majority, as well as the entire sort of separation of powers. So that is really, really important. On protecting, well, we have a 145, as you know, 2/3 have been won in the parliament. So it's very important that you have also hear the voices of the opposition, protect basically their hearing also, the checks and balances.
Thanks, Asanga. Briefer, then I need to, yeah.
Sorry.
Latoya, just a brief response to these two questions. I mean, I think that gives you a segue to kind of sum up the whole constitutional change as well as political realignment.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the 2 points belong together. I think what was asked regarding the constitutional change will much focus on the one country, one law thing. So going away from community rights to citizen rights, going away from communities to really citizens. And if this really would happen through the constitution and through the changes accompanying this constitutional change, we would also see the changes in the political landscape. We would also see maybe political parties arising which go away from focusing on ethnic or religious identities towards questions of shaping the country economically and politically. So really agenda-driven political parties which are not discussing identity politics. And these 2 points really very much belong together, and now we have the opportunity that this could happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chulani, briefly.
I think with regard to political realignments, in my opinion, what we saw is that personality is taking over the individual parties. But I agree with what Dr. Wagner earlier said, that this is a new era like in 1956. So I would say it's still quite new. So we have to wait and see to what extent that these political realignments will continue, or whether it will go back to a system like in pre-2015, where all the parties come together as a coalition against Rajapaksas because they think they are too strong and they want to defeat. When it comes to constitutional and changes, I think this constitution will most probably decide to answer the question of federalism and unitary state. So I think Latoya explained it quite well. So that will also sort of like explain to what extent how the minorities will look at the government, and also to what extent SLPP would be able to build the gap with the minority.
Thank you. Christian, I mean, gives you a good...
Yes, thank you. As I said, I'm wondering in how far this election may be a watershed election for Sri Lanka futures, the political development this has to be seen in the next elections. I would be more skeptical about the constitution, because giving the vote share, giving the political dominance, I think this constitution will show or will bring us more majoritarianism and less federalism. But this, of course, will also create new challenges for the government in how far to integrate the different minorities, or in how far to make the developments also, or make development deliverables for the minorities. And I think this will be a major change. I think it will be it will be a transformation from future identity politics to something new, and I think it will be an important challenge for the government to really make deliveries on these new prospects, how to integrate minorities into this new constitutional framework.
Thank you. Amitendu, you had any final thoughts on the...
Just to reiterate, Raja, I think the external debt situation is very serious, and I think it's imperative to handle it as fast as possible. But I would also like to share that the kind of mandate which this current government has received probably gives it the opportunity to go to the people and say that, look, these things are bad. They are certainly not going to be good unless and until tough decisions are taken. So I hope there is some out-of-the-box radical thinking in that regard.
Thank you, Amitendra. It's before I hand over to Christian Ackley of the CAS, I just want to say a couple of things. So one, that I think we must be optimistic. I think I believe that political moments like this, when there is strong mandate and there is strong leadership, can actually open space for breaking out of the kind of logjams that states and countries find themselves in. The question of minority-majority relationship, the nature of the economic strategy that Sri Lanka had adopted, the nature of its relationship to US, China, and India. All these kind of seem to constrain Sri Lanka in the last many years. But today, can a strong leadership find creative ways of actually turning this international situation to its advantage? So which sometimes countries, external pressure sometimes is useful. You can say that, look, there is no alternative. As Amitendra said, you have to do some things. Sometimes the contradictions in the international system, the easing of some of the pressures externally gives you opportunity to do more things on the state and society issues. And the rivalry among the major powers actually also creates more leverage for Sri Lanka, where you can bargain better than before with the dominant powers. So my sense is that we in ISAS, of course, are deeply committed to Sri Lanka, which is of an important country, a priority country for most of us here. And there's deep interest in Singapore and in ASEAN area to see a successful Sri Lanka. So therefore, we'd love to see and engage more on the issues that were raised today. And I want to thank again CAS for being so supportive to us. It's always been wonderful working with you. So I'll hand over to Christian to have the last word this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Raja. And indeed, I think this can be described as a common cause for the work of both ISAS and Konrad Adenauer Foundation to see strong countries in South Asia, to also see strong regional cooperation. So I'm very, very thankful for the event today, for the insights that were shared by the panelists, and of course also for the audience that followed this presentation and discussion. Let me just highlight a few points in my closing remarks. I think we heard 4 excellent inputs on the political domestic situation, where I think we learned that there's a lot of chances. Basically, the new government has all the cards in its hands with a big majority, a majority that can lead to a change of the constitution. And this really enables the new government to prove that they are worthy of the trust that they received during the election, and that they can bring Sri Lanka forward. We had a more balanced perspective, I would say, on the situation of the society with the constitutional changes being discussed right now. I think it was highlighted both by Latoya Vaha and by Christian Wagner that there are opportunities to overcome the identity politics in particular, but that these changes also could lead to short-term conflicts, and that the new government again has to prove their way, the proof what they kind of laid out as the principle for the constitutional changes, that it will really work and benefit the people in Sri Lanka. We heard a more skeptical position on the economic situation of Sri Lanka with high foreign debt, and of course in the situation of COVID-19, a very challenging situation to turn things around economically, and a strong reminder, I think, that outside of the box thinking might be required in this particular situation. And we heard, of course, very relevant inputs on the situation of security and international cooperation for Sri Lanka, with, I think, a clear trajectory that Sri Lanka will put more effort into being a neutral power, a balancing power in the region. Of course, the geopolitical and strategical position of Sri Lanka is out of question, so it will continue to play an important role in the region, and it will be very interesting to see how this unfolds. Also, of course, given the history of the Rajapaksa presidency and the at the same time, the discussions that were given during the election, both the presidential election and the parliamentary election, going forward in this area. I would like to thank very much the High Commissioner for her very valuable input at the beginning. I think it was great to bring us all up to speed and also to get a really clear idea of where Sri Lanka wants to go going forward. I would like to thank all our 4 panelists and Christian Wagner, who came in at a later stage, but also with very important input. I would like to thank in particular Asanga. If he looks a little bit older than usual today, it's not about the quality of his webcam, but it's because it's his actual birthday. So congratulations, Asanga, and thank you very much for doing this today instead of celebrating your birthday. I would also like to thank the audience. I think we saw a very engaged discussion. This is great. I think we have all experienced a certain Zoom fatigue. It's really very encouraging for us, I think both for ISIS and for CAS, to see that discussions like this can be held in virtual space and that there's engaged discussion and big interest amongst the audience. Last but not least, I would of course like to thank our valuable and dear partners from the Institute of South Asian Studies, led by Raja Mohan, who did a fantastic job in moderating this whole event as well. It's really always a pleasure to work together with you. As I said, there's a strong common agenda to strengthen regional integration in South Asia and to understand South Asia and to bring South Asia forward. This is done by ISIS from the Southeast Asian perspective. It's done by Konrad Adenauer Foundation from the European perspective. And I think our work is really important in that area. And I'm looking already very much forward to the next cooperations we will see. Last but not least, I would like to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Nishal Pandey, who is the coordinator of our COSAT network, which is a very important pillar of our work in South Asia. It's the consortium of South Asian think tanks, a community of think tanks that also works on regional integration, is of course this year very much involved with the question of how COVID-19 effects can be overcome in the region. So please follow both ISIS and CAS on their work on South Asia. You know the web pages, you know the Facebook pages. For the rest of today, I would like to thank you again for being with us, and I also would like to wish you a wonderful weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.